All right, so I know it's been a few days since, or it's been more like a week since I uploaded last. I mean, anybody who's watched this channel long enough knows that I don't have a regular schedule, so it is what it is. I do appreciate the people that watch this channel and watch my videos. Please understand that I do have arthritis, and sometimes I'm just in a lot of pain, believe it or not. And in fact, actually, today, this morning, probably about, I don't know, 1, 2, 3 a.m., really early in the morning, it started to rain. It just started to pour and pour rain. And I was in a lot of pain actually the day before that. So before it started to rain last night, I was in so much pain because of how like the pressure changes and the weather and all of that. So that was one of the reasons why some basically my point is that sometimes I just don't upload because I'm in pain. And actually that's one of the reasons why I ended up recording pretty much the second half to Susan Atkins' book in 2026 uh, off camera because I recorded up to like chapters 15. And right before I started recording those last three chapters, it was like, I don't know, uh, actually 12 through 15. So, like, technically four. Uh, right before I started recording those last few chapters on camera, I had this horrible pain in the bottom of my neck and it went straight up, and I felt so nauseous and sick. And for me, when my arthritis is really bad, sometimes I feel almost like I have to throw up because that's just how bad it could be. But anyway, thank you to everybody that has, that bears with me, that is patient, because I know obviously I don't upload every day. Not that I want to upload a video every day because I have a quality of standard for myself personally, and uploading a video every day would drastically lower that standard. And so, anyway, with that out of the way, here is actually a review for something, and it is actually Manson related. So, this is my review for Helter Skelter, the 1976 movie. Movie, not the book. Anyway, okay, so Helter Skelter is a movie that came out in 1976, which was a pretty accurate reenactment of the book from of the same name. You know, the book Helter Skelter by Vincent Bugliosi and Kurt Gentry, which, of course, Bugliosi's book came out in 1974, so 2 years right before this movie was created. And I know I'm reading a review that I wrote myself, but I just want to preface for anyone that's not too familiar that this was made for TV. So if you could even come across this movie, because it's kind of rare at this point now. If you could come across this movie, just understand that the quality isn't obviously like what you would see or hear or find in the cinema in a theater. But here is the review that I wrote and my thoughts, which I'll be honest, I don't even remember. I don't even know how I came across it myself. I do know that I saw because anyone who knows me, and if you watch these reviews, I do use Letterboxd, so I do know that I at least came across the page for this movie on Letterboxd, but I don't even remember how I came across the video itself. That's all I'm gonna say. But I did watch it. So, I think the movie did a pretty good job casting certain people for roles in the movie, though some people I did think were questionable. I wonder if some of these people were cast in certain roles so as to protect the real life versions of the people they were playing. For example, the actors for Susan Atkins and Charles Manson, I thought were cast very well. Seriously. There's a lot of people that are, if they're into Charles Manson and the Manson family, they're very finicky, picky, meticulous over who plays Charlie. Many people feel like damn near any actor that ever plays Charles Manson ever is a terrible actor. I'm going to be honest. I think that, what was his name? Dan Railsback. Sorry, my spinny chair keeps spinning. But anyway, so the actor that plays Charlie, I thought did a really good job. He obviously noticed, followed a lot of the real life Manson's mannerisms and facial expressions, and I think he legitimately did a good job. So the actor and actress that played, Charlie and Susan Atkins, they looked very also much like their real life counterparts, which is another reason why I thought they were good actors, good casting on that part. On the other hand, though, the actors for Danny DeCarlo, Shorty Shea, Kitty Lutzinger, William Garrettson, Ronnie Howard, those people, those characters didn't look like their real life counterparts. But I did think, as I watched the film as it went on, I figured that the reason why some of these people did not look like their real life counterparts was likely because, for the sake of the innocence in this film, it was probably better not to have their likenesses shown to the masses. You understand? Because this was 1976. In fact, I believe this was before Ronnie Howard was murdered or died, right? So this is right before the real life Ronnie Howard died, and not even 10 years after the Tate LaBianca murders. So this was still so fresh in the public's mind, and showing or having actors that look like the real life version of these people might have put their privacy in jeopardy. I'm sure that there probably would have been people who would have tried to find and potentially harm the real life people that did testify in this case. I noticed that some of the police characters in this movie, especially when they would refer to Kitty Lutzinger, in the movie they would call her Kitty Lassinger. So just a very, very small, tiny difference, but not Lutzinger, Lassinger. I'm not sure if it was maybe because I couldn't read or if that was once again to protect the real life Kitty's identity, which would also make sense because at the time the real life Kitty Lutzinger was still a teenager. She wasn't even 18 when, of course, the murders happened. I did find it funny how the actor that played Bugliosi had more hair than his real-life counterpart. But I also found that Bugliosi's actor was a very good choice. He, I think, performed the Bugliosi role very well. He captured the real-life Bugliosi very accurately, and I also liked the fact that the actor, I believe his name was DeCenzo, so he was also Italian, just like Vince Bugliosi. So I think, once again, that's also a nice choice. I really like that they did that, But anyway, so watching the movie, it appears that they went to some of the real-life locations or areas close to the actual crime scenes or places of interest with the Manson family. Now, this was, once again, 1976, so chronologically, in real life, Spawn Ranch, the real Spawn Ranch, had already burned down. So I'm not sure where they went to create the fake Spawn Ranch, but their recreation of it was very good. I did end up looking up, I believe it just even said on IMDb, I believe, that one of the websites I went to, the film crew actually went to Waverly Drive, the real Waverly Drive, to record a couple of scenes. They show the actual house in the movie, though the outside of it, not the inside. And this was an area of contention. Maybe it said it on Wikipedia, I think. But either way, they went to the actual Waverly Drive place, and once again, this was 7 years after the murders. And so people that lived in the neighborhood actually had a problem with that, of course, because, you know, the people that lived in the houses to where the LaBiancas were murdered were like, hey, we don't want any more attention in our neighborhood. So it's interesting, but also strange that they would go there. You know what I mean? But hey, Hollywood, right? Anyway, the movie doesn't depict the spiral staircase or Gary Hinman, though, of course, this would be in line with the book, Helter Skelter. Bugliosi wasn't on that investigation or, I believe, either trial, if I remember correctly. I know that on Cielo Drive, the website, there's only one version. They only have the 1969 trial with Bobby Beausoleil for the Hinman trial, and if I understand correctly, Vincent Bugliosi was not the prosecutor on that case. But I don't remember who was. Anyway, though. So, seeing, though, the actual physical work that the police had to do from their perspective in the movie, I can actually see why the Manson family really seemed to think that they wouldn't have gotten caught. What I like about this film is that this was a recreation of the book, and you physically see a recreation of the police work, though obviously it's not perfect, right? There's this scene, I forgot to write this down, but in the beginning of the movie, the setting for what was Cielo Drive, which wasn't the actual house, by the way. The setting for Cielo Drive had, of course, the recreation of the murder scene, which was pretty brutal, I'll also say. I don't even have to screenshot the recreation that they did for Sharon Tate's final resting spot, which was like, wow, they showed that on TV? My God. But anyway, at the beginning of the movie, when they're showing the crime scene at Cielo Drive, one of the police officers or whoever it was, investigators, that was inside the house, they walk past Jay Sebring, and the actor's foot gets caught on the towel that was supposed to be on Jay Sebring's head. And I was like, was that supposed to be in the movie? Or was that something that they messed up and just didn't want to re-record? You know, there are small little hiccups, I'll say, in this movie. And some people have also criticized those hiccups in the reviews. Like, for example, later on, I had read somebody had criticized how there was a scene with the police, and one of the police officers goes up to the other group of officers, and he's like, "Are you guys on the Tate LaBianca case?" or something like that. And one of the detectives is like, "No, we're on LaBianca. Tate's over there." And it's like, oh yeah, that is kind of redundant. Are you on Tate LaBianca? No, we're on LaBianca. Wait, that doesn't make sense. But small little things aside, I will say overall I like this movie. But let me get back to the details, okay? So, once again, my point though, even with these small hiccups, which you do see with some of the scenes of the police work, I did think that this movie did a really good job in depicting how much physical work, how manual it was, how analog it was for the police to do their job, and how complicated and complex and intricate this web was for the crime, for the Manson family. And so once again, because of how many threads there were with the Tate LaBianca murders, I actually understand why, surprisingly enough, many people in the Manson family didn't think they would get caught. This was before computers and digital archiving of what we have today in 2026. So back in 1969, it definitely would have seemed impossible to many people to connect all of the ties between all of the people involved at Spawn Ranch and the murders, you know. Even though this movie was reenacting many of the real life events, it still put into perspective how complex the case was and nearly impossible to correctly categorize who did what. I also like that they left in certain parts of the book that show the mess ups and errors and just how many things got tied up thanks to the bureaucracy, if you want to put it that way, with the LAPD, you know. I mean, for example, they leave in the scene, or they reenact from the book the scene or scenes really of how the gun that was used at Cielo was not properly added to the investigation until months later, you know, and that happened in real life. So I really do like that the book, I like that the movie showed those parts of the book where there was a lot of I have to call it like it is. There were a lot of fuck ups from the police in this investigation because they were so caught within the bureaucracy, if you want to call it that, you know. So I keep thinking in my head that one phrase from Return of the Living Dead where the one guy, I can't remember his name, but he says, you know, typical army fuck up. Because that's what I think of. That's what it was with the police, with LAPD, and even the sheriff's office when it came to the murders in the Manson family. So much of it was just, you know, typical law enforcement fuck ups that it's like, y'all should have connected 2 and 2, but they didn't. And that's why it took so long to formally arrest the Manson family on these murders. But anyway, back to what I wrote down. So, considering how daunting a task it was to connect everything together and how everything was still completely analog, physical, written down on paper, I understand legitimately why there were people back when even the trial started who were legitimately afraid that the killers would go free. You know, hindsight is 2020, and for me, I was born after the murders. I was born after the trials, and so reading about the Manson family and the Tate LaBianca murders, at first I didn't understand, like, what, y'all really thought they would go free? There's no way. There's no way. But the more I've read about this case, the more I've understood. I read about history and how America was back in the late 60s and early 70s. A lot of our justice system was surprisingly more lenient than it is today. So there was actually some truth, some legitimacy in the fear that even if these people were convicted, well, after so many years, certain people could have actually gotten free or been released on parole, which in a strange way could have happened if Vincent Bugliosi, in my opinion, didn't write his book. I don't want to get too deep into it because I'm I'm like straying from my review, but I've always wanted to point out that I think it's very interesting how near the end of Helter Skelter, the book, that Vincent Bugliosi kind of wrote his predictions of how long he thought certain people that were convicted in the Manson family would be incarcerated for. And one person that always sticks out in my mind, of course, is Leslie Van Houten, where in Helter Skelter, the book, he pretty much predicted, or let's say theorized, I guess, that Leslie would be incarcerated for probably about 7 years and get out on parole, eventually be set free. But of course, that didn't happen in real life, or not to say the book was completely fake, but what ended up happening in real life after the book and all the events and everything, Leslie was incarcerated for 50 years, 52 technically, completely. Strangely enough, I think that Bugliosi pointing out that this was actually possible was one of the reasons why I truly believe so many people were against the Manson family when they would come up for parole. But anyway, so it's kind of strange. So I just think that I just wanted to always point that out. And I do think Bugliosi did that on purpose, in my personal opinion. That's just my opinion. I think Bugliosi pointed that out on purpose so that people would say, hey, wait a minute. You mean these people could eventually get parole? That thing. So anyway, which actually this does tie in with the review, because at the end of the movie, he kind of says this, or his character says this when in the very, very final scene. So anyway, back to the review that I wrote down. Sorry for straying. So, further in the movie, I could tell that some of the names to other characters were changed. As stated before, some more were Sandra Good and Squeaky Fromy. So in the movie, I don't remember off the top of my head what Sandra's name was, but Vincent, well, I say it was Bugliosi, but I guess probably just the writers to the movie, right? But in the movie, Squeaky, I distinctly remember, is called Cindy, but you could so easily tell it's supposed to be Sandra and Squeaky because the actress for Squeaky, or Cindy, right? Her actress really copied the real Lynette Fromey's mannerisms and facial expressions very, very well. So that was another thing. I'm like, certain people had very small roles, but the real life counterparts that they were portraying, they did a very good job of. And the actress that, copied the real life Lynette Fromey did a very good job, because it's just that kind of odd strangeness to them. And that scene that I'm talking about in particular is something that also actually happened in the book, where I distinctly remember Bugliosi saying that when he met Sandra Good and Squeaky Fromy, he found them kind of odd. They were nice, but very childlike. And he offered them candy, like as if they were little girls, and that's how they acted. Anyway, but I also imagine that the reason why they changed the names for these two characters in particular, these two people, for the movie, right, was that this movie came out in 1976. And this is likely due to the fact that just a year before, Squeaky Fromy attempted to assassinate President Ford. So I imagine that if they used her real name, Squeaky Fromy, Lynette Fromey, it probably would have actually scared audiences even more, and might not have even allowed the movie to be shown anywhere between TV or even cinema, I think the movie also did a great depiction in showing how unsettling the Manson family appeared to normal people. In the decades since the actual murders, this has been one of the things that for me has been hard to understand. And that might seem strange, like, what do you mean? Of course they're scary. And it's like, hear me out. I was born in 1993, so once again, everything was already done and over with, concrete. These people were locked up by the time I was born. I was born the same day Gigi Allen died. I was born a year before John Wayne Gacy was executed. For me, it's never really emphasized how horrifying the Manson family was to the average person when the crimes initially happened. Because understandably, many people that have an interest in the Manson family are typically about Gen X, if not baby boomer type of age range. Typically, because most of my videos are about Charles Manson, many people in my audience are actually typically baby boomers, if not older Gen X. And so many of you that watch my videos have told me that it was scary to see this stuff, in your childhood or in your early 20s and stuff like that. I have a couple of other examples actually too, where I have asked some people I've met in real life, what did they think? Because as someone born after all this went down, I just could never understand the terror it put in the everyday person. In fact, so when I've talked to other people, those that were young, like I said, when this all happened, most people I've asked, and I don't ask too many, but the ones that I have, they don't go very far into it. They don't talk too much about what it was like. So I actually remember one person, an extended family member, because I was like, what? You were what? One person I know, first person I asked, he was 19 when the murders happened. And I was just like, what did you think? And he told me that he just couldn't understand how people could fall for Charlie's bullshit. I mean, that's like verbatim. He literally said, I just don't understand how they could have fallen for Charlie's bullshit. And that's kind of my answer, right? What did people think? They didn't understand it. How could you fall for this, right? And that's something I've thought to myself too, reading the books. Like, how could you believe Helter Skelter, the race war? That doesn't make sense, right? But anyway, another person, I had talked to, kind of also older age, she told me that after the murders, all the parents in her neighborhood would call the kids back home when the street lights turned on, and everyone would lock their doors after the murders. So that answers my question. That's how scary the Manson family was to regular people. A time period where it used to be thought of as fun and happy, and you could just walk up to people's houses and their doors are unlocked. After the murders, people were calling their kids home. They're locking their doors. The street lights are on, come home. And that's another thing. So my whole point going back to this movie is that I really like that this movie does emphasize just how unsettling it was to talk to these people in the Manson family. How unsettling it was to be like, oh my God, out of all the people to be murdered, it was, a pregnant woman and this person and that person, seemingly random, right? So another thing I found very interesting in the movie was how Bugliosi's character was talking to another lawyer who was supposed to be Aaron Stovitz, but of course looked nothing like the real life version. So, okay, right there we see, okay, we have Aaron Stovitz depicted in the movie, but the movie version is like balding and he's kind of like a ginger, da-da-da. But what's also interesting with this scene in particular, while he's talking to Stovitz, right? What was interesting was that Aaron Stovitz in the movie tells Vince that it would be hard to keep Charles Manson in custody and hard to convince a jury that Charlie was the one that orchestrated the murders. This scene was very telling to me, and you can see where the idea of Helter Skelter, the Helter Skelter theory, started to form, in the movie, right? This is obviously where the idea must have started to form in real life, right? Because it would be hard to prove conspiracy. So this was like foreshadowing in a sense. You could see that Bugliosi obviously had something in his head trying to formulate a way to connect Charlie to the murders. This confirms to me something that I've thought about ever since reading through much of the court transcripts to the Tate LaBianca trial. So my thought is that the Helter Skelter theory, now for I'm not even. if you're watching this video, you already know what I'm talking about. So my thought is that the Helter Skelter theory, the race war theory for why the murders occurred, Tex Watson and the others murdered people because they wanted to start a race war, that idea, this idea to me is not necessarily fake. It's just the main one they used. So to me, I've always felt that they've just used the race war idea as the main idea as a way to put Charles Manson away in prison. I know this is kind of convoluted and I know people are going to disagree with me, but this is how I feel about it. So, the reason I feel this way, though, is because if you read through the court transcripts, Leslie Van Houten even stated that she was offered a deal to basically give up Charlie. To me, it's clear that the police had been watching Charles Manson for a while, which they were, and you can go on to various places online. My favorite place to read about this kind of stuff is mansonblog.com, by the way. But there are various places you can read about this, that the police were watching Manson, but they never had anything that they could use to put him away for a long time. There were certain things, obviously, Manson got arrested for, and he would, be let out. He kept getting locked up and then let out. Charlie was constantly slipping through law enforcement's fingers. And this is proven even in other books by Manson family members. Diane Lake's book, Paul Watkins's book, and even Susan Atkins and Tex Watson's, I believe, too. All of these books written by Manson family members themselves, have talked about times where they've been locked up and then let go. To me, once again, that's proof. Hey, we got him. Oh, now we got to let him go. They kept getting him and he slip out of their fingers. The biggest example truly would be the Spawn Ranch raid, where because of because of the inaccurate warrant, they were able to arrest them, but then because the warrant was incorrect, they had to let them all go, So, and that, to me, that's proof. That is obviously proof right there that the police had been watching Manson before, for a while. It's obvious law enforcement has suspicions on Charlie already for other things. There's more crimes from that area which are never even talked about. A lot of sex crimes, but because no one would sell out Charlie before Tate LaBianca, police couldn't legally do anything to arrest him. I remember distinctly, here's one thing I find so interesting in particular, is how Paul Watkins, for example, worked with Bugliosi in helping put away Charlie. Yet, ironically, there's never been very much emphasis put on the fact that Paul Watkins was essentially getting women for Charlie, for sex. Isn't that in some way trafficking? Anyway, trying to keep it with the review here, but I hope you understand where I'm coming from, where there were multiple things that were going on, which many Manson family members and Charlie himself never went to jail for, were never taken to court for, but obviously arose suspicion with law enforcement. So going back to my main point, I've always felt the Helter Skelter race war theory was just the main thing that Bugliosi and co. used to put away Charlie, because that was the best they could come up with, truly. I feel like the race war theory, the race war idea that was used in court was really how to put Charlie away forever. That's the best way to put it, because it's so clear that Bugliosi didn't want to put away Charlie just for 5, 10, or even 30 years. It's clear that Bugliosi, I think with the more he found out with the investigation and, discovery, as they say in legal terms, the more Bugliosi found out with the details of the murders, I truly believe he wanted to put Charlie away forever. And Helter Skelter and the race war was his way to do it. That's how I truly feel about it. And I know many people will be like, well, what do you mean? Do you mean they didn't believe in Helter Skelter? Yeah, but no. Truly. You know, I feel like unless you go through the court transcripts, you probably wouldn't question Bugliosi. And I think that was the original intention of this movie and the original intention of Bugliosi's book. I don't think he ever anticipated people being able to read the court transcripts, you know? I don't think people would have ever questioned it, right? I think in many ways Bugliosi truly believed that people would have taken his word and said, okay, that's good, you know, despite the fact that because of the fact, at the end of the day, the killers were locked up. So I guess Helter Skelter was right, you know. But once you start looking for the truth, that's when the Helter Skelter theory starts looking funny. You know, this is just, of course, my opinion, right? But I don't think Bugliosi expected Helter Skelter, the law theory, to be seen originally as the end-all, be-all for this case. I don't actually think Bugliosi anticipated his book to be practically the Bible for people to go through for the Manson family, and something referred to, used as reference material for parole hearings for the Manson family either. I don't think he anticipated the way the book ended up being received, let alone, of course, this movie. I don't think Bugliosi expected people to care about Helter Skelter and the Manson family decades after. I really don't think he did. So, in a strange way, it's like he too put himself in a bottomless hole with this, right? Because the Helter Skelter theory doesn't explain everything, and much of the actual truth doesn't make sense in comparison to it. I don't want to get, of course, too deep into this because I keep kind of going off on tangents, but it's hard not to go off to veer, hey, you're going the wrong way, right? You know, when you talk about the Manson family, there's so many different circles to go into. But, you know, I want to keep about the review on the movie. I will say, though, that there are parts of truth. There are parts of the truth to the actual crimes and, of course, the Manson family themselves and their culture. There are parts of the Manson culture and parts of the actual truth of what really happened that the Helter Skelter theory seems to deny. One of these that I found is how Tex Watson and Susan Atkins were, without a shadow of a doubt, on drugs when they were at Cielo Drive. This is something that is brought up in Tex Watson's book. Sorry, I'm trying to be in the video, the camera. This is something that is talked about in Tex Watson's book, Will You Die For Me, and Susan Atkins' book, Child of Satan, Child of God. Now, for some reason, as seen in Susan Atkins' 1978 parole hearing, Stephen K. denies the fact that they are on drugs. But I suppose that this was to ensure that Susan wouldn't be let out on parole under the excuse of, oh, it's okay, I murdered people. I was high. Because in context, historically, looking through articles from the 1970s, you know, that looking through articles from that first decade after the murders, there were a lot of people that believed the murders happened because of drugs, but not just because it was a drug burn gone bad, right? There was also a group of people that believed the that the murderers only murdered because they were high, which is inaccurate. They were on drugs, but it's not the reason why they committed murder. You understand what I mean? So, there are things that the Helter Skelter theory didn't get right, but to me, I still believe this was the only way for Bugliosi to convict Manson and put him away for life. Because without that conspiracy charge, I really don't see any other way Manson could have gotten or been sentenced to death. You understand what I mean? So, of which, like I said before, Charles Manson was definitely doing other crimes during the time period of 1969, but he was never brought to court for, obviously. You know, there's things in Diane Lake's book that she talks about that he did to her that he should have gone to jail for, obviously, but he didn't. So, sorry, I know man, this is a long video. Sorry. But back to the movie review. What's interesting about the movie, like I said before, is that they changed the names of different characters. Another example of this is later on in the movie. They just kind of briefly talk about the Russian roulette scene where in real life the person who died from this supposed Russian roulette was nicknamed Zero, John Philip Hott. In the movie, they don't mention his real name, I don't believe, or they don't make a fake name, right? They just mention the nickname. Now, in real life, his nickname was Zero. In the movie, they changed the name to Boots. And they mention another person's name, another Manson family member, and this person's name is changed also. And I think the Manson family member they're referencing is supposed to be Bruce Davis. But other than that, there isn't anything else talked about Zero, Bruce Davis, or their movie counterparts. I don't believe there was even any sort of actor that depicted the fake Bruce Davis. But they did have one very small moment where they show, or barely show, someone that was supposed to be Mary Bruner. And it was very interesting that in the movie, they, as in Vince Bugliosi and Aaron Stovitz in the movie, they act like, oh no, yeah, we just gave Mary Bruner that immunity deal so that we can, convict Beausoleil. And it was very interesting that they say this because I, off the top of my head, didn't remember him saying that in the book. And it was very interesting how just through the movie, the people that they ended up giving deals to, immunity deals to, some of them, they act in the movie like, we don't really want to do this. And I kind of wonder, was it like that in real life, Tying into this point, I found it interesting how the movie depicted Vince and the others, like I said, Vince, Aaron Stovitz, not really wanting to give Susan Atkins, for example, the immunity deal that they originally gave her, which of course this happened in real life. I and other people have never understood why they gave Susan Atkins, of all people, an immunity deal for her grand jury testimony. But, of course, here in the movie, it seemed more like a reluctant legal deal, which, I do understand, because, of course, at the time period, the idea was that they really had nothing else to go off of. Without Susan agreeing to go in front of the grand jury, they had next to nothing, and trying to convict even these people that they know committed murder, but legally they had nothing to stand on. So the grand jury scene did have a great deal to show. The grand jury scene did a great deal. I think they did a good job showing Susan Atkins as horrifying, which I truly believe in real life she was. I wish that they did leave in or put in this part from real life. In the court transcript, you can read this, where in real life, Susan Atkins called Stephen Parent the thing in the car. They didn't put this in the movie, but this might have been because of the fact that if they did, they probably wouldn't have been able to show the movie on TV or anywhere in theaters. I think it was very interesting how the depiction of Susan's grand jury testimony did not show her crying once, just like in real life. Not a single tear was shed while recounting the bloodshed. The movie brought up a good point when Susan told her story to the press, where her doing so would have made finding a jury difficult. And what I mean is not the grand jury testimony. They just barely show, like in a small scene in the movie, how Susan sold her story to the news. But she only sold it to the European news, not American press. Yet the American press still posted her story in the news. This is the Susan Atkins's 2 Nights of Horror thing. What I thought was very interesting, though, was that with this point of how she sold her story about the murders to the press, the point was brought up how this would make finding a jury for the trial difficult. I never thought about it until I watched this movie, but I see now how this could have actually been a legal move done on her part to potentially prevent a trial from nearly happening at all. So I think that in many ways this movie did a good job in showing actually just kind of the legal struggle it was in trying to prosecute these people, because there was constant, just blockages or potential blockages that could have prevented this even going to court. So once again, I go back to that earlier point I made where seeing this like kind of physically in action, seeing it physically recreated, I understand why people were afraid that the killers could have gone free, because it was damn near impossible to even bring this to trial, So I do understand more about it, that mentality when this was going on. So the movie goes on to show that Vince, actually struggled with creating a case, not just in general, but really struggled creating a case against Charlie. The movie has his character even saying that the case against Charlie was weak. It makes me wonder if in the decades after this movie came out, if Bugliosi potentially regretted this being admitted. The movie also helped me realize how so many people ignored what were obvious signs to the crimes. Because, once again, the crimes were so ridiculous and outlandish that a normal person wouldn't have originally connected these things, such as many of the spiritual aspects, actually, of the Manson family. Because to people that have no experience with drugs and some of their spiritual contexts, majority of the details pertaining to the Manson family made and still make no sense. But of course, no sense makes sense, right? I found it interesting, too, how Bugliosi's character had pointed out that people were only looking at conventional signs and clues about the crime, when, of course, nothing about this was conventional. For the most part, to a point, I agree with that. Though there are still aspects I will always feel were brought up by Bugliosi that were just far stretches to barely prove his legal points. I feel like many of the Beatles points that Bugliosi brought up were a bit questionable. I'll just say that much. At least in the context of the crimes, right? I don't doubt that, these people listen to the Beatles nonstop and stuff like that. But so many people question, in the decades since the murders, many people have questioned more just why these victims in particular. And I don't believe that the Helter Skelter theory truly explains that. But anyway, back to the movie, though. The scene where Bugliosi and Paul Watkins were in the room together was also interesting, as it was pretty much the main scene in the movie that was used to tie in much of the Helter Skelter theory together. Many people, like myself, doubt this theory, and I've read online where some have said that the whole idea, Helter Skelter, the Beatles and Revelations, all of that stuff was just an idea that stemmed from Paul to begin with. It was Paul's idea and never even Charlie's, some people say. I don't know how many people believe that Charlie believed in Helter Skelter, I don't know. I mean, me personally, I feel like I just need to read more about Charlie's transcripts before I can make a complete judgment on it. But I've always found Helter Skelter to be questionable. I will say that much. But when I first ever read Jeff Gein's book, that was the first book I ever read about Charles Manson. I got to the point about Helter Skelter and the race war, and it just seemed too out of pocket, and it seemed way too far out. It never made sense to me. It never even made a slight smidgen of sense, any of that Helter Skelter stuff. And so that's why, yeah. What was interesting was how Paul's character in the movie pointed out that they used the Catholic Bible, which is actually something I totally forgotten. I was like, wait, did they even mention that in the book? But they do, And I just want to point this out that from what I understand, there was nothing put in this movie that wasn't in the book. But there are certain parts in the movie that are kind of maybe mixed together or squished together for the sake of time. So some of the stuff right before this where they talk about, the fifth Beatle, blah, blah, blah. You see Bugliosi talking to Paul Watkins in the movie, but actually in the actual book, Helter Skelter, the fifth Beatle kind of stuff was actually apparently a conversation Bugliosi had with Greg Jacobson. So slight differences there, but for the most part, anything in this movie is actually in some form mentioned in the book. So I do give points to this movie for that. But anyway, I totally forgot, though, that they reference the Bible, but it's not King James. In Helter Skelter, it's pointed out in the movie and the book that apparently the Manson family would go off of the Catholic Bible, the Douay Rheims book, anyway. So the point of this, though, was apparently the hole in the earth thing, which referred to Abaddon, or as Paul Watkins says in the movie, the actor says Abaddon. So I don't know if it's Abaddon or Abaddon. But in the Catholic Bible, Abaddon, Apollyon, this demon, as he's also sometimes referred to, in the Catholic Douay Rheims Bible, it says is also referred to as exterminants. And I was like, wait, what? That's pretty nuts. So, because first of all, I think, why is this left out? Because apparently in the King James version of the Bible, it doesn't mention this. And I looked this up, and it's true. There's plenty of websites where you could find various versions of the different translations of the Bible. And I compared it, and it's true. The King James Bible does not mention the part of exterminants, but the Douay version does. And speaking of exterminants, that shirt back there is from an album called Exterminants. That's pretty nuts. Ritual killer? Exterminants? That's pretty strange. From the Douay Bible, too. Anyway. But to quote Helter Skelter, very quickly. So in Helter Skelter, the book, it says, To members of the family, the identity of that fifth angel, the ruler of the bottomless pit, was never in doubt. It was Charlie. So it should say verse 11, where apparently verse 11 reads, "And they had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek tongue hath his name Apollyon." The king also had a Latin name, which, though it appears in the Catholic Douay version, was inadvertently omitted by the translators of the King James Version. It was Exterminans. Exterminants, true name, Charles Manson. So hopefully I can show a clip from the movie where it shows this. I thought it was so nuts. I don't know why I completely forgot that part of the book, why that even happened. But anyway.
Here's verse 11. "And they had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon." You see, Mr. Bolios, you got the King James Version here. Charlie had the Catholic version. And in that version, the angel of the bottomless pit also had a Latin name.
Do you remember what it was?
Sure. Exterminans.
Exterminans. Charles Manson.
So, further in the movie, it appears that they also renamed Irving Kanarek, so, the lawyer who represented Manson during the trial. And in the movie, he's referred to as a man named Scoville. Considering how Scoville units are what are used to measure the heat of chili peppers, I found that this was an appropriate name or renaming for Kanarek, who I'm sure would have done something legal to oppose this movie using his real name. Later on, Ronald Hughes is mentioned in the movie, though of course his name is changed too. It appears that all the defense lawyers have their names changed, though not all of the lawyers were referenced by name. In the movie, Ronald Hughes was called Terry or Terrence Millick, which I found that's kind of interesting. Terry Millick, Terry Melcher. That was probably unintentional, though. The movie doesn't seem to show the switch from Aaron Stovitz to Stephen Kay, and probably for good reason. From what I understand, Stephen Kay wanted to distance himself from the trial after it was over, and understandably. The movie also doesn't talk about the switch to Maxwell Keith for Leslie Van Houten. They only mention how Ronald Hughes, or as he's called in the movie, Terry Millick, went missing. But what's interesting is that they brought up how Leslie, well, they don't even say like Leslie's lawyer. They just mention how this lawyer goes missing in Sesame Hot Springs, but then they don't bring it up again, and I do think for the sake of the movie, watching the film, it's like, that's kind of strange y'all brought that up and then do nothing with it. But I know, of course, in real life that really happened. One of the lawyers went missing and was found dead, But what's strange is that they didn't bring up in the movie, at least in the version I saw, how he ended up being replaced. So I wish that they would have at least said that. I don't know why they didn't bring that up, because of course in real life Ronald Hughes ended up being replaced by Maxwell Keith. Not sure why they didn't just have a small 2-sentence dialogue thing. They should have brought that up and they didn't. I don't know why. What I appreciate about the film is how it depicted the insanity and circus that the trial was. Of course, Helter Skelter, the book, talks much about the trial, but many movies, even to this day, don't. Few movies have ever depicted the insanity that went on, and what's seen in the film isn't even far off from the real thing, actually. Even if you don't believe the Helter Skelter theory at all, many people just believe Vincent Bugliosi made it all up. It's all a lie. Even if you don't believe Vincent Bugliosi 1%, there are still things that Charlie, Leslie, Susan, and Patricia did in court that I think still made them guilty. Like, they acted so insane in court, I think everybody was just sick of them. Really. You know, in fact, the movie actually had to leave out things from what I've read through the court transcripts and even the other books. But the movie did a good job at showing how Susan Atkins was much more into the cult than she would ever actually admit in her book. There are depictions, of course, of insane outbursts and the defendants being taken to separate areas of the courthouse to listen to the rest of the trial, which is, of course, accurate to real life. The movie even actually showed the part during the trial where Manson tried to attack Judge Older. That's actually a scene in the movie. You know, that's real. That doesn't have anything to do with like the Helter Skelter theory and the murders. Like Charlie was just being crazy in court and he tried to attack the judge. That's real. That happened. That was in the news. You know? So what's really interesting to me, of course, was how the last part of the movie shows Charlie and Bugliosi talking, and they actually take Charlie's last words from the interview track that's on the album Lie. In the track, the actual like album Charlie released, Charlie says, "You can't fight for peace and you cannot capture freedom." And the interviewer asks Charlie, "Then love is the total answer?" And Charlie replies with, "If someone beats you with a whip and you love the whip, what's he doing? Making a fool out of himself." To which he laughs. And this phrase about the whip is actually what is stated in the movie for Charlie's last line in the film. So I thought that was very interesting and strange in a way, but it makes sense that Bugliosi would have listened to Charlie's music, Charlie's album, because of course the music, any money that album made went towards Wojtek Frykowski's son, which to this day I don't know where it goes, but anyway. So the movie ends with a depiction of the Manson family members with shaved heads, including some of the people that were outside of the courthouse, which of course was true to real life. Since this movie came out in 1976, this was actually before any of the convicted were eligible for parole in 1978. The film ends showing the characters and stating that they'd be eligible in what was barely 2 years at that time, which I'm sure was scary. You know, I'm sure that for any of the people who watched this film when it originally came out and remembered the crimes when they happened in the news, this was frightening to think about. I actually give credit to Bugliosi for having the film depicted this way, because without that fact, some of these people could have gotten parole very easily. I think that without the book, Helter Skelter especially, Leslie Van Houten probably would have been released from parole maybe even before I was born, honestly. But I know that many people dislike and have disliked Vincent Bugliosi, and I do know that he wasn't a perfectly good guy. He definitely wasn't the squeaky clean lawyer that his public persona tried to uphold. But in a strange way, I couldn't see anyone else being able to try this case and getting the death penalty like he did. I will always think that it was a shame and a miscarriage of justice that the death penalty was overturned a year later after they were officially convicted. Which I do want to point out that they even show in the movie the scene where Charlie, just like he did in real life, somehow grabbed a newspaper with the whole Manson guilty Nixon declares. That happened in real life, and they show that in the movie. So it's just very interesting how much of this movie follows the book, follows the real life events. You know, I give a lot of credit to this movie for that. But even though they got the death penalty and it was overturned, I still think that the justice system had the last laugh in many ways. Susan, Leslie, and Patricia all admitted that they were ready to die for their beliefs and for what they did. They were ready to die. But were they ready to live with the fact that they killed people? Were they ready to live with it? You know what I mean? In Susan's book, Child of Satan, Child of God, Susan even admitted herself, not that flat out, but she does say that she was struggling with the fact that she'd be locked up for the rest of her life. You know, she was starting to lash out once she got onto death row, basically. In the short film Life After Manson, Patricia admits that she wasted her life. The irony is not lost on me how death would have been too easy on them. And the real struggle is, of course, life. And I found that funny, you know, because isn't that something Charlie and the other girls mention on the album, Lie? Right before the track Arkansas starts, someone who to me sounds like Squeaky Fromy says, "We struggle, and we struggle, and we struggle." Almost like a badge of honor. So I suppose it was quite fitting for Susan, Patricia, and Leslie to struggle, because isn't that the life they chose? What I find interesting is how the movie showed how Bugliosi knew it would have been hard to convince a jury of conspiracy, you know, of Helter Skelter and, you know, Manson. Ironically, considering how the defendants all acted in the courtroom, though, I really think that their behavior had a lot to do with the guilty verdict. Honestly. In articles from some of the jurors after the trial was over, it was clear that many of them were just so tired and that it ran a lot longer than it ever should have. One female juror had called Manson a shrimp, you know. Apparently, there were people, at least some of the jurors, that were surprised when they saw Manson in court that despite the crimes, he was almost nothing like they anticipated him to be. He was a lot smaller than they thought he would have been, you know, I don't want to get into the height thing, but sometimes, you know, I don't know why there's this debate over Charles Manson's height. Anyway, so the film, though, had some pretty interesting names in it, in my opinion. So, of course, for example, Vincent Bugliosi was portrayed by George DeCenzo, and Linda Kasabian actually was... I realized I really didn't write about Linda Kasabian in this review. There's not really too much to say, though, but her actress was Marilyn Burns, who was in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. She was the final girl in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre only 2 years before. So that's actually really amazing to me. And there were some other names from the old Hollywood kind of circles, such as Skip Comeyer and Ray Middleton. I think it's easy to say that this film was a pretty big deal, and there was definitely a genuine interest in people portraying the events to this. In a way, too, I imagine it must have been kind of hard to cast people for this film, probably at first, considering that it was about murders that happened in Hollywood. One article I found stated that it cost $1.4 million to create this film. And I believe it was in the same article that stated that supposedly, and I don't know if this is true or something they just made up for the press, but apparently some of the people that worked on this film got strange, mysterious calls where people would call and the phone would be silent and then they would hang up. And then some people would get calls and there would be heavy breathing and then the person would hang up. So there was a little bit of creepiness that went on while this movie was being created. Of course, we can't prove who might have been doing those calls, if the calls were even real, but it does make you wonder, were there Manson family members stalking people when this movie was being made? Or was it just, pranksters, right? I don't know. We don't know. We can't prove it. Reading about this, I believe it says on Wikipedia, the movie originally came out as a two-part that was made for TV, a two-part TV series, though apparently in some places it was actually shown in theaters and cinemas. Looking through the newspaper archives, it appears that there were people who felt the movie was sort of exploitative in some ways and was a way to help boost Vincent Bugliosi's budding political career, which we know by now didn't go anywhere. I think it was fair, though, to question whether or not the movie was a potential ticket to paint Bugliosi in a good light, as he had very ambitious career goals. One article I found actually stated that because the movie, I believe, came out in March or April of 1976, but in Los Angeles, they postponed the movie being shown until June of that year because they didn't want this movie to influence how people thought of Bugliosi in his political endeavors. And of course, when this happened, Bugliosi wasn't happy and he wanted people to see the film when it came out. But apparently they still waited until June for people in California to see the movie. And I found that very interesting. From what I understand, despite the commercial success of this book, many people just wanted anyone and anything associated with the trial to go away. I couldn't help but question it myself, actually. I wondered, what was the point of this being made into a movie? It wasn't surely done out of the purity of Vincent Bugliosi's heart, as a way to help people easily digest what is a 600 to 700 page book. Was it really just for that? Because I don't think it was. I did feel in many ways that the movie was very aggrandizing for Bugliosi, truly. For God's sakes, he's the main character. He's the main character. He's the hero. He was the one that created the motive for the crimes, connecting it all together to be brought in a court. He was the one that created the book, which the movie is based off of. It all comes together to make him look like the undeniable good guy to those that don't know anything more about the case than from what is in his book. Obviously, the movie is an advertisement for the book, too, We can't act like it isn't slightly suspicious that the prosecutor to the case ended up creating the best-selling true crime novel of all time, thanks to Charles Manson. Bugliosi's method of being on the trial, then making a book about it, is something that other lawyers would actually go on to do in real life. One example of this are the lawyers that were on the John Wayne Gacy case, where the prosecutor for the Gacy case made a book about it. And then Sam Emirani, actually, John Wayne Gacy's own fucking lawyer, sorry to swear, Sam Emirani actually made a book about the thing himself, too. So, Bugliosi like set this precedent for lawyers that prosecute, or not even prosecute, lawyers that are on huge cases that make books about these gigantic cases. Charles Manson, John Wayne Gacy, and in fact, actually, one of the lawyers for the Jodi Arias trial has a book too. And those are just three, I guess technically four examples. I'm sure there's more from there. Even though Charles Manson wasn't a good person, we can't act like Bugliosi was either. In fact, you can just read this part on Wikipedia, where around this time period in the 70s, off the top of my head, I don't remember the year, but in the 70s, Vincent Bugliosi had a mistress somewhere around this decade, and he was apparently violent with her, got her pregnant, and wanted her to get rid of it, to put it easily, for the sake of YouTube, right? So there weren't too many true reviews for this film in articles when it came out. I couldn't find, just general reviews of what people thought of it. The ones I found usually just summarized the movie, or of course they went off about Charles Manson himself and not even talking about the film at all. One article I found, though, from a Canadian paper did bring up a good point, though, where they said how Bugliosi's book and movie ended up making Charles Manson a star, famous inadvertently. And I actually agree with that. I truly believe that Vincent Bugliosi unintentionally, I guess you would say, Streisand himself, the Streisand effect in a way. Before that term became a thing, I feel like he did that to himself. Thanks to his meticulous book of details about the investigation and the trial, many more things about the Manson family are remembered than if the case was just done normally, honestly. I think the one thing that truly keeps Charles Manson's memory alive is Vincent Bugliosi's book, Helter, Skelter. Honestly. I wonder now if all that time Vincent Bugliosi, stayed up late, working late, because that's in his own book, and it shows it, in the movie too. Vince stayed up late. He would work all the time, doing stuff for the trial. How much of that time was spent preparing this book? Preparing the book that became Helter Skelter. I honestly believe that he took the case because he knew, I think he saw dollar signs when it came around. It shows in the movie itself that he wasn't the first lawyer to hear about the case. And it's actually not completely unknown. It's not a secret that actually other lawyers denied the job before him because it was actually too hard to prove. Too hard to prove at least Manson in the very least. As stated before, I truly believe the Helter Skelter theory even became a legal point. The only reason it became a thing was just a way to get Charlie. For me personally, I've always wondered, why did Bugliosi try so hard to get Charlie when he could have easily just, prosecuted Patricia, Susan, and Tex and moved on with his life? From a legal standpoint, he could have very easily convicted and potentially even still gotten the death penalty for Tex, Patricia, and Susan. I truly do believe that. But I think he had to use Helter Skelter to get Charlie. And of course, he had to use Diane Lake to get Leslie. So this doesn't mean, though, that Helter Skelter wasn't something the Manson family talked about. If you read court transcripts, it definitely seemed like a thought that some people had. It's something that was definitely part of the Manson family culture. I don't doubt for an instant that there was definitely some racism and weird white supremacy vibes with the Manson family. It's very clear that some of these people just had this weird thing to them. I'll put it that way. I don't think I could really talk about it on YouTube, honestly. But But you know, this group of criminals, the Manson family, was surprisingly diverse. And some people were also more spiritual than others. Linda Kasabian's transcripts actually seem to prove this, and they even lightly touch on this in the movie, where in the movie her character says that she used acid and LSD to basically get closer to God. It seems to me that Patricia and Leslie in real life seem to believe more of the spiritual aspects of what the Manson family had going on, while personally I don't believe Susan did. I truly believe that Susan wasn't actually into the Helter Skelter idea, not in the same way that Pat and Leslie were. And in fact, she actually kind of seems to touch on that in her book when she was in death row, you know? In many ways, I feel like Susan was just one of those brutal criminals that just wanted to kill for the sake of killing. Honestly, I don't think for her it had anything to even do with race in a strange way. You know, she just hated society. She just wanted people to die. In a way, Susan's 1978 parole hearing seems to confirm this, where Stephen Kay stated that Susan was found sharpening knives after Gary Hinman's death. So, to me, the idea of a race war didn't seem to be believed by everyone. I know that people will disagree with me on my opinion for pretty much this entire review, but I just want to leave the Helter Skelter theory and talking about that for a completely different video. I've already strayed so much and this video is so long, right? But overall, I do think that this is a good film and one of the better ones. One of the best ones, truly, about the Manson family, believe it or not. Despite a lot of the stuff that I don't like about, of course, the legal side of Helter Skelter, right? This is one of the better movies that talks about the murders. Of course, I wish there was more emphasis that was put on the victims, but I know that the movie was supposed to be about the book, which, of course, everything that happens in the book is after the murders. I watched a 3-hour version of the movie, which, when I was looking up the articles from the 70s, from 1976, some of these articles said that the movie was 4 hours long. So I don't know if this was just an error. It probably was. But, or if maybe somewhere there's an extra hour of footage that I just didn't get to see. I don't really know what it would be. I mean, pretty much the movie follows the book very, very well. So if I actually missed an hour of footage, I guess I could just read the book, Helter Skelter. But original versions of this, as I said before, were split into 2 episodes when it came out on TV. Granted, I don't know if it equated to 2 hours between, for each episode. So kind of from an outside point of view, or trying to think of people from an outside point of view, I don't know if this movie is something that a person who is totally unaware, like if you knew nothing about the Manson family and the Tate LaBianca murders, I don't know if this would be a good watch. I don't know if somebody that is, like a baby to this situation would find this interesting, honestly. I think you would probably have to know quite a few things about the murders, about the case, about Charles Manson before even watching this film. I will admit, though, I think this film is more niche, It's kind of like preaching to the choir, I guess you would say. in the decades after the murders and the decades after this film, it's definitely something for people that are deep in the rabbit hole already. I imagine that when this first came out, you obviously didn't have to explain the basic facts about the murders because, of course, in 1976, at that point, most people likely already heard about it through the news coverage, the extensive news coverage. Interestingly, though, speaking of that, the actress who plays Susan Atkins in this movie stated in a news article that she was actually out of the country when the actual crimes, occurred, and she didn't know much about the trial at all. But even still, if you knew nothing about Charles Manson, I think this would probably very confusing to watch in all actuality. The viewer isn't told much of anything about the victims, how it went down, or any of those details about the crimes itself. In retrospect, it actually seems to bolster the idea that this was to prop up Bugliosi. We're supposed to see Vincent Bugliosi as the undeniable good guy and Charles Manson as the undeniable bad guy. And yes, Charlie was not a great person, but as time goes on, it becomes apparent that Vincent Bugliosi made some extremely questionable choices with the trial. One thing I found interesting about the film, as I kind of just hinted at earlier, was that there was not a single scene in this movie about Diane Lake. As far as this movie was concerned, Diane Lake did not exist. There was not even like an actress with a fake name, a different version. There wasn't even like a Diane Pond, Diane Ocean. No, she just didn't exist. Yet, of course, in real life, Diane Lake's testimony was the one thing that helped convict Leslie Van Houten. Without Diane Lake's testimony, there was nobody else to truly confirm that, yeah, Leslie was at the LaBianca household. She took stuff from the LaBianca house, So I do find it strange. How strange is it that Diane's testimony is also not included in any of the court transcripts? Like the actual transcripts, if you go onto Cielo Drive, that portion is gone. There are digital recreations of those transcripts, and Diane Lake's testimony is not available to read. I believe, even though I don't really care for Tom O'Neill in his book Chaos, I do believe he does touch on the idea that Vincent Bugliosi was taking paperwork of those transcripts or various parts of the trial without legally being supposed to do so, right? Diane Lake's testimony is among certain parts to the court transcripts that are missing to this day. And her part is not the only thing either. That's part of the whole, why is that missing? And what was Bugliosi's idea with some of those legal choices? That's what I mean by questionable. This is very questionable. But anyway, even still, despite all of that, believe it or not, I still liked this film. Seriously. And I felt like it did a good job, truly. At the end of the day, we can't deny that these people were murdered. Even though I have read essays where people deny that the victims were murdered. No, they were. I have seen the autopsy photos. I've seen the crime scene photos, and they are real. These people are dead. We can't deny that. So, despite Vincent Bugliosi's attempts at fame, I do also believe he actually wanted justice for the victims, believe it or not. I think that the more Bugliosi found out about the defendants and the actual details to the Manson family and their crimes and just how horrible they were, I truly believe he became disgusted with them, especially actually as the trial went on itself. And they did everything they could to be obnoxious and prolong everything. Sometimes I wonder if Bugliosi asked for the death penalty not because he saw it as necessarily right, but to send a message. Looking back, historically, I guess you would say, I really wonder if Bugliosi knew or had an idea that the death penalty was going to be abolished. Because considering how ambitious and in many ways accurate he was as a lawyer, I think it's questionable. Like, you didn't know they might get rid of it? You know what I mean? Was the death penalty worth getting? Would the death penalty be worth shooting for if they get convicted and it's overturned, you know? But I don't think that really mattered to him. To me, I think that Vincent Bugliosi wanted the death penalty because he wanted to show the defendants that even if they don't get executed, they should have been. You know, I think that's the message he wanted to send to them. Of course, you know, there's also other reasons for it, another being as a way to deter any potential wannabe criminals from doing the same thing to other innocent people. So, despite certain details being left out or names being changed, I do think that this was a great retelling of the investigation and the Tate LaBianca trial. Of course, I wish that they would have talked about Tex Watson more, but it would be impossible to fit all of that in one video or even the two separate episodes as it originally was. I wonder if they considered doing a separate one just for Tex, but maybe just ultimately decided not to. There's a reason why people think of Charles Manson and not Charles Watson. I'll put it that way. In comparison to Charlie, I guess maybe just Tex Watson is just not as interesting, at least for TV and movies, right? Even though he's the one that killed all those people. So, anyway, the movie has now become rare to find, and as I am recording this, it's not available for stream anywhere. In fact, I don't know how they could even stream this, like on Tubi. Would they make it one whole video? Probably, you know. But if you can find this online or buy it on Amazon, whatever, if you come across this, I do say, you know, just watch it. I do think it's worth the watch if you know about the Manson trial. And I think that if you want to see a film about the trial, this is probably the best one you will come across. Because like I said before, most movies, even made after this one, skip over the trial a lot. Even most books about Charles Manson skip over the trial. Because it was just too long, I guess. But like I said, if you want to see something about the trial, this is the main one to go to. Of course, you have to know about the Tate LaBianca murders to understand it. And I also at least give credit, though, to Vincent Bugliosi creating a film on it. I give him credit for creating a film on the trial, you know, as others from that time period. And just in general, many movies about the Manson family aren't very good. Most are exploitative, and most almost make a mockery of the victims, which I really hate, you know. But despite Vincent Bugliosi's ambitious goals and what does seem to be a grab for fame, there are still many things in this movie that are true. There are still many things that, even though he wanted to be seen as like the good guy that should, get the public position for whatever political thing he wanted. Strangely enough, it seems many people just saw him as the good guy anyway because he was the prosecutor. He prosecuted the Manson family. People saw him as the good guy anyway, you know. But anyway, overall, I liked this. And believe it or not, I give this a 4 out of 5 stars. A lot of that is because of everything else I've read about the Manson family and the trials and the court transcripts. In that sense, I think it's very good, and I think the 4 out of 5 is deserved. So that's it. I'm sorry for such a long video, but thank you. If you watched this whole thing, thank you so much. If you've watched this and you're not subscribed, please subscribe. I talk about true crime and the Manson family quite a lot because it's just so ridiculous, honestly. But thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.